Amazing, 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 amazing. Thank you all for entertaining me on that. Oh, Sing Goldschmidt. What a powerful combination that is. I am really grateful to be with all of you here today. We are here for another Kernel Fireside. Would love to know what other musical instruments people are playing. Thank you, Maya, for kicking that off. We're off to a musical start today in module 5 of Kernel, which is tokens and mechanism design. I'll do a little bit of framing this week. Really, my instinct is to go straight to Expo Week. And Expo is an event that's been around since the beginning of Kernel. It traditionally is at the middle of the block, and this is the first time that we've moved it to the end. And the reason is because Expo has traditionally felt like this place where the in-between ideas can more easily flow through. It's going to be hosted in the Gather, where if you sign up for Expo, you'll have a small audience of maybe 2 to 5 people that will try our best to craft, but also will have a bit of randomness to it, depending on who wants to come and see what you are up to. But it's intended in that kind of small, intimate setting to be a place where you don't feel so inclined to pitch any particular thing, but to share the root or the seed of whatever idea it is that you are exploring. And we really want to encourage you, even if you don't feel like you have a fully formed project, or if you do, to pick a particular part of the story that you might be willing to expand upon for 4 or 5 minutes, just to give a sense of why it's exciting to you. I'm looking at different people here, and just as an example, I know Jess has been interested in starting a DAO that explores movies and creatively viewing and experiencing the art of film together. And so you could, in a traditional pitch, maybe talk about what you thought the future was for this particular idea and come up with a roadmap and try to put it into a PowerPoint. But that's not what we're trying to suggest with Expo. We would rather hear, what is the favorite show that Jess, you're watching, so that an idea like this came to be. Why would it propagate into that direction? So that it might be enjoyable for others to view those things with you. And so I hope that invitation encourages people at any level of their adventure. We already have about half of the slots filled, but if you are interested, the flow is in the Slack. We've sent it a few different places. Let me see if this link flows. And we would really love for anyone who's interested to sign up. We think it'll be a lot of fun and a beautiful way to end the block. So again, the sharing, the ask is for just something that's moving with you. And that's the way that word poetic is used at the bottom of the screen. We want you to share what is moving within you, so that we might collectively explore it together. So thank you for listening, and we totally welcome you regardless of whether you feel that you want to present. You're going to be more than welcome to be there, and it's already on the calendar for that last week of Kernel. And we're getting closer. And so I'll pass the mic to Andy. Module 5 really gets us into the meat of some of the future forward-looking things, the way that the word token expands beyond a lot of the use cases that we might see today. So the syllabus, Andy, I will pass it to you.
Thank you very much. Can we think of Expo as a way of hosting discussions rather than presenting ideas? There's an interesting directionality to it that allows for more generative and honest explorations of what is truly interesting rather than projections of what you hope other people might find impressive. And that applies in some way to the syllabus this week, as we've as I've highlighted in previous weeks, the first 4 modules kind of look backwards. What is the thinking apparatus with which we will approach all of the problems? Where did Bitcoin come from? What is Ethereum? What is the history around these things? How did they develop? In response to what did they develop the global financial system as it currently exists, and some of the subtleties and nuances around it, both in terms of collectibles, in terms of debt, in terms of shadow banking, and then looking at this widespread narrative that has been prevalent since really the beginning of like networked communications and technologies, of taking back some kind of power or the appeals to authority that have been necessary for large-scale human coordination across the ages. And then the next 4 modules, beginning last week, with what are the institutions, customs, and rituals that we can use to think about coordination, to think about cooperation, to think about these evolutionary changes in our ability to live well. And having thought through some of that stuff, reclaiming our time, augmenting our ability to think together, and remembering, really remembering the kind of humility and creativity that goes into reimagining in a consistent fashion the social relationships on which our lives are premised, moves us into a discussion about incentives and stories. In the incentives piece in particular, we make we trace another etymological root, just as we do with tokens. So this week, as we look to the future of what tokens are and what they can be used to do, we begin, as is always the case, spirals within spirals, by looking backwards and thinking, okay, well, the word token comes from the Germanic Dutch tachen, to teach. Tokens are something which transmit facts, and in computer science or linguistics, they are the shortest possible series of bits that transmit a fact fully. So tokens are something which transmit facts, which authenticate us as being the holders or bearers of those facts. Facts themselves are not strongly coupled to truth as the connotation might carry, but have to do with a very specific notion of value. If you follow the video on the index page in Module 5, you'll see a really wonderful talk given by a language designer, a man called Rich Hickey. He talks about facts as values, again, tracing the etymological roots as we look to the future of what these things might be, and recognizing that facts comes from the Latin factum. It is a past participle, and it means a value that is associated with particular times. And we can see these in the systems that we develop, right? The fact that Bill Clinton was president doesn't change when Barack Obama becomes president, or George W. Bush. It's just that another fact gets written, another value gets written into that append-only log as we go along. That's how we establish ongoing consensus, social reality. And when we can understand these things at a deep level, look into their meaning and their trace, we can begin to decondition all of the connotations that come along with these words and look at the possibilities for building systems based on our understanding of the primitives that genuinely allow for more playful ways of making accessible and inclusive the so-called invisible flows within society. This is what incentives are really all about, right? If you go in and look at the incentives piece, and we discussed it yesterday in the Learn Track Yontos, which I encourage you to come to on Wednesdays, then you'll see that incentives are really an incantation or a charm. That's what the word means, that enables us to render visible, or not render visible, but throw a veil over the shape of the unseen flows that inform the ways that we relate to one another. And this particular module really begins to try and make a case for how, with minimum contrivance, we can reveal a maximum amount of truth in a pro-social manner through considering deeply the narratives that we tell ourselves, the narratives that we tell each other, the way that we listen to and receive information in the world, and the underlying structures which make all of this possible, how we can surface those in more collective imagination such that we can begin to really consider what the sense of some of these structures is and what they allow us to sense collectively as we feel our way into an always dark future that is only illuminated when we bring our present moment to it. So that is some insights. I wonder, Sevna might have joined us, although she might still be on her way somewhere.
Yes. Yes, we've gotten word from Sebnem, who's our guest, that she's actually going to be a bit late in transit today. Seems like in the physical world, she has some things that she's been attending to. So maybe another 20 or so. Let's see when she's able to join. I also don't want to rush her and if she has some pressing things. So we'll see how that goes. But her background here was intended to be a beautiful pairing for conversation, because Sebnem is a token engineer in the systems sense of the word. She's a systems architect, comes from that background, working on peer-to-peer technologies as far back as 2006, and has been thinking quite deeply about different architectures for tokens, including one that we're quite familiar with in the kernel context called the invisible economy. And this idea of invisible economy definitely rings with some of the ways that Andy is speaking about incentives as incantation, or things that kind of silently in the background at their best can move, as opposed to like the ones that are the most visible. So given Sebnem's not here, I suggest perhaps we open it up for a moment as kind of like a thing that we rarely get to do in the Firesides, which is just kind of like have a kernel-esque discussion and have it be more driven from the start, from the group. So if you're willing to, if there was anything from the way that Andy framed it, anything about token, fact, or factum, or facts as values, or listening that stood out to you, maybe we could start there in a discussion and see where it takes us, and welcome Sebnem into that if and when she's able to join us. So really would appreciate that if anyone has anything that feels like a place we could begin.
I think one thing that Andy said, minimum contrivance transmission, got me thinking of startup buzzwords, first of all. But it's an interesting, feel like it's an interesting design question. Like, what's the least complicated way to send a fact so that it's received as a fact? Yeah, it just feels there's something to the math of tokens, like JWTs, JSON web tokens, like a way of logging in and sending an authorization from one server to another, where the authorization is decryptable in a key. So the data itself can be decrypted with a public key, or the sign can be checked rather, that then can be trusted that this authorization was given from one party to another. and it doesn't require an intermediary as long as you trust that the math works. So that seems like yeah, contrivance is an interesting word there. Like if you consider the math to be like sort of the simple universal language that can be understood and accepted. Yeah, but anyway, it just got me thinking about that as a kind of design aesthetic when we're creating systems of communication.
That's beautiful. That's really, really beautiful. Thank you for that. So I think that's even just to mention JSON Web Tokens and encryption already broadens our perspective of what tokens are. You know, we get so locked into our own little contexts whenever we start down a particular rabbit hole, and then tokens come to mean only this one particular and financial primitive as it applies to a very unique set of kind of still fringe technologies that are slowly making their way into broader awareness. And the notion here of contrivance is such an interesting one to me, because precisely, I mean, you can take it in the direction that you did and think about like the curves and the mathematics that sits behind particular encryption schemes, whether it's asymmetric encryption or AES or, you know, whatever scheme you wish to talk about. Or you can think about it in terms also of like game mechanics, which is what's going on in the syllabus this week, in the sense that minimum contrivance allows us to demonstrate truth in a way which can be experienced rather than consumed. And that's really interesting in terms of thinking about the verification of facts. Don't trust, verify. You know, what does that really mean? Because in week one, we already said, right, like don't trust, verify is a really interesting maxim because it implies accessibility in education as necessary prerequisites for a fully functioning system. And while we can have these protocols for the transmission of facts that don't require intermediaries, the end goal of those isn't a trustless world. It's a place where we can come to explore new and different kinds of trusts between each other as a result of not having to rely on the messenger. And when we begin to really like consider that and look at it without contrivance, you see that like the minimum possible, the most minimalistic design aesthetic is the one that is able to enable this in the most profound manners. And this is really what Jonathan Blow and Mark ten Bosch are talking about in that video, which is in module 5, where they say, you know, like in V, 6 Vs, which is a wonderful game where you just like have to navigate a little character through mazes that have like little Vs on them. If you touch the sides, you die. And through the most incredibly simple mechanics, one mechanic in terms of how like gravity works and how you can jump and flip to a different side of the maze. You can teach people enormously interesting geometric facts about like the way in which to navigate kind of like seemingly impossible bends and curves, and you can make these like crazy in-jogs that happen. Or in a different game that you have to shoot kind of light bridges across gaps to navigate a map. In like a really, really wonderful example, this is the only game mechanic that there is: shoot light bridges across gaps to get to a different side. You then like shoot a bridge across one way and you're trying to get to a gap that is down there and to the right. And you have to like shoot the bridge, go halfway across it, and as soon as you shoot another bridge, the one that you're on disappears. But if you line up perfectly, then you can like shoot the next bridge in a way which gets you to the door one level down and to the right. And this way you end up like learning a whole bunch about three-dimensional geometry with this incredibly simple mechanic. The other example that they give is reversing time in one of Jonathan Blow's games, which is really incredible. And like through a simple mechanic of reversing time, almost no contrivance. It's just that if you move left on the map, time goes backwards. That's it. And all of a sudden, this rich world of like possible gameplay emerges. Right? And I think that it's fascinating to see because it's so intuitive to computer game designers and people who do this kind of stuff. And we come in and think that, no, like we need to design like an incredibly complicated mechanism that's got all sorts of stuff in all sorts of different ways that we're trying to model with different kinds of methodologies. And we've got like a circle over here and a triangle over here and a database and all sorts of things. And we think that that's an expression of cleverness, but in some ways it is, right? Cleverness. And I don't mean that in a good sense, because like simplicity is the ultimate key when it comes to both game mechanics and mechanism design, generally speaking. The thing that ties all of this up together is, again, Rich Hickey, where he talks about like language design. When you're a language designer, you're trying to, in computer science, design what are called domain-specific languages, DSLs. What you're trying to do when you're designing a language, and consider that like a language is just a subset of mechanisms in general, right? Like language is a mechanism that allows us to communicate things to one another. So language is a subset of mechanism design space. And in language design, which is quite a well understood problem in computer science, Rich Hickey, the designer of Clojure, one of the most powerful functional languages, makes the point that you're not trying to create all of the primitives that you need in order to express whatever is in your head at this particular moment. What you're actually trying to do when you're designing really powerful languages is to come up with the minimum set of orthogonal vectors required to map the space. I know it's a lot of like complicated words. What he's saying is like you just need like as many, you just need as few kind of, orthogonal means at 90 degrees, right? So you just need as few expressive directions as you possibly can in order to like map the full space of stuff that you could ever want to stay, not the stuff that's in your mind right now. And like, to ground this in an example, Bitcoin does this surprisingly well, despite some of the ugliness in its design, by saying longest chain is the most valid one. Proof of work is how we add blocks to that chain. You have two vectors that are orthogonal to one another that then create this rich expressive space for what money could mean in a peer-to-peer world. Just those two things, longest chain, proof of work. That's all you need, and everything else has followed from the surprising coupling of those two vectors, right? We've learned a lot about like proof of work and other things as a result of now playing the game for 13 years. But that's the game, right? That's the whole game. Longest chain, proof of work. All of this stuff comes of it. The Bitcoin white paper is 6 pages long, 6 pages, right? It's woefully underspecified, but look at the effect that it's had in the world. And when we're talking about tokens, incentives, mechanism design broadly, I always just come back to this particular point that like tokens are not what you think they are. And it's much, much more simple than we think it is. Simple doesn't mean easy, right? Easy, the etymology, it means near to us. You can grab it if you want it. Simple means one twist, one thread, right? As opposed to complex, which means many threads woven together. And what we're aiming for is simple, which is really, really difficult to do, right? It's almost unimaginable that Bitcoin actually did it. And like, that's why people think that it was dropped on a mailing list by aliens. But, you know, that simplicity of longest chain, proof of work, the orthogonal vectors, which somehow managed to instantiate this hugely expressive space for peer-to-peer money, for the transmission of facts about what we value, is just endlessly fascinating.
Brennan, if you would like, could continue the flow.
Yeah, that was really beautiful, Andy. And it raised to me the difference between complexity or complexification of a network and complication of a network. Like as the network grows wider, you get deeper connection, and that necessitates, you know, more simple rule sets. But larger rule sets restrict the way nodes can connect. and you create a more fragile, less resilient network, looking at it from like a complex systems angle. And it's interesting to see the parallels between complex systems and mechanism design and the way that, you know, players in a game are like nodes in a network. The thing that I wanted to raise was this notion of tokens as representation of facts is really interesting to me, especially in light of a lot of the wonderful discussion that y'all have opened up about facts and truth and communication throughout the fellowship so far. I think, especially in Western society, we tend to treat facts as fungible, and in some ways they are. But information or communication is highly contextual. And so it's interesting to think about the difference between fungible facts, non-fungible facts or information, right? And how that carries over to tokens, like the metadata associated with a token. And earlier in the chat, I mentioned Jordan Hall's appearance on Kevin Owaki's Green Pill podcast. He kind of flips things on its head a little bit and raises an interesting point that the default should probably be non-fungible tokens. Like that's what we should generally refer to as a token, because when you look at the way things are tokenized in normal life, you know, like I have a picture of my girlfriend sitting on my desk that is a token of my relationship with her and my deep connection with her. And you could print 1 million of those pictures, but they wouldn't carry the same information, or the fact wouldn't be readily available to people who are viewing that as just a commodity. So it's interesting to think about the non-fungible nature of facts and the way that they're interpreted, the context around them, and how you go from information to communication.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for that. So I think there's this well-known law online, right? That like complex systems have always evolved from simple ones, and no system that begins as complex ever becomes simple or is in any way like resilient. I've misstated the exact law, but I'm sure that if we ask Philip Sheldrake or somebody else, they will be able to provide the exact link to, it's not Metcalfe's law, but it's one of the others. It's just slipping my mind now. And the reason that I start there is that this is one of the reasons why the kernel syllabus is structured the way that it is, right? Interweaving personal inquiries with technical ones each week, because the ego wants to think that complicated stuff is more important, that it's more weighty, that it's more smart, that if I can put together a diagram which I barely understand, then other people will respect me, because like if I barely understand it, they for sure can't. And they're gonna be like, wow, he's so intelligent, right? And like, if we want to build systems that genuinely help us cooperate, that genuinely help us gather around more truth with less contrivance, that whole thing has to be seen for what it is, right? It has to be seen for what it is. You have to notice it. I'm not saying destroy it, or just saying notice that particular proclivity which exists in all of us to be recognized and validated as a thought leader is an incredibly powerful intrinsic motivation, which often goes unnoticed and which often leads us towards like either complex or complicated systems first, right? I'm not against complex systems. They're inevitable and they're all around us all of the time. What I am suggesting is that like when we can go on the personal inquiry of just seeing the stuff that really motivates us and why we engage in the work that we do and why we feel a certain way when Toby Shoren comes on and says, we're all cultural designers, don't you know? You know, when we can see that and just notice it for what it is, then you can begin to like deal with half the equation as it relates to like complicatedness or complecting your design, is what Richeki says, right? Complicating it unnecessarily, adding too many threads too early on. What you want to do is like any problem that you pick, right? To quote John Muir, pick a single thread, pull it for long enough, and you will find a whole universe attached, right? So the problem is not adding threads. You know that no matter what problem you take on, it's going to it's already complex. Even your desire to try and like solve it is complex. So what you're trying to do is in fact get to that simplicity, to get down to that single thread, which is the most impactful thing that you can do. And as much as I love Jordan Hall and that particular insight about like how non-fungible most things in the world are, what I differ with him on is that like it's not about should or shouldn't, right? It's not that like tokens should be non-fungible or shouldn't. The fact that more fungible tokens exist than non-fungible ones is very interesting because it gives us deep insight into human behavior and motivation, right? We like fungible tokens, despite the fact that they're much less frequent in the world around us, are much more powerful financial primitives. And they play into certain expectations and conditions that we have about what it means to organize and coordinate, what it means to compensate people, what it means to be rewarded or recognized, validated as individuals or as groups. So like good designers start with that. Just notice it. Don't put your own like should or shouldn't, just notice it, right? Like that's the way that it is. And then we can begin to like open up and say, okay, like, so what do truths, facts, and meaningful communication have to do with one another? Well, yes, they're all based around tokens, and we can bring in this wider understanding of what tokens are. And in fact, we can go all the way back. Sina Celso brilliantly suggested the mathematical nature of really succinct and really succinct and eloquent symbolic communication to Claude Shannon's seminal paper, right? The Mathematical Theory of Communication, in which he establishes the bit, right, as the ground level units of information, and he defines the bit as unexpectedness, right, surprise, right, like the quantity of information that a message transmits has to do with how unexpected the like arrangements of that information is, right? Like that's really interesting because it then, as you say, like it does lead us to recognize that we can't really treat facts as fungible. There is this aspect of time which is associated with them, and there is an aspect of like unexpectedness and information value, which is really interesting to consider, right? Particularly if we can like move past our own projections of what should or shouldn't be and just into, well, that's interesting. You know, how did that happen? And it reminds me, if anybody was in the gaming guild yesterday, Arthur Rowing Bear and GVN were talking about this kind of stuff, right? As it applies to moving castles and designing games in which changing the logic of governance is an inherent part of the gameplay. It's totally fascinating, right? And in fact, when you're doing that kind of stuff, the idea is not to try and design a game that leads you to the most optimal, efficient, and pro-social collective behavior. It's to like write rules that will enable people to do what they want to do and let the game evolve according to it. So like if people want to like play the domineering king, and if another group of people want to play the anarchic emergent group of people trying to coordinate and reach consensus, let both of those things happen and see what occurs in the gameplay, rather than prejudging what the outcome ought to be, right? That's what Jonathan Blow and Mark ten Bosch also pointing at, this like open narrative worlds, right? Which enable people to investigate in increasingly surprising or unexpected ways the scope of their own agency. Like that's fascinating. That's what like incentives richly imagined have to do with, right? Like, because the more aware you are of the incentives that drive your behavior, both those that are already existent in the environment within which we find ourselves and those which come from me, then you understand more and more and more about who you are and what you really have control over, what your agency in this world truly is. And that's the most unexpected of the whole thing, right? So I'll leave it at that. It's a wonderful inquiry and investigation, Brennan, truly.
It feels like two alive points might be between Fotis and Blue in the chat on some of the history of Shannon information from Fotis, but Blue, if you would like to expand on your questions, that could be a place we go next.
So which questions in particular?
The first one was the difference between reductionism and the perception of simplicity. But if you feel there are other directions, please feel free.
Yeah, so just in the context of complex systems, which we were discussing, I had first said that all systems can be seen as complex systems depending on the scale that you look at them at. So like wherever you choose to evaluate the system will depend or will determine whether it's a complex system or not. And, you know, the discussion of simplicity is, I think, like wonderful, and some of the most elegant solutions are the most simple. Fundamentally, like I see that and feel that, but I worry that we, in searching for the simple, elegant solution, like, are we being reductionist in nature and not taking into account the system as a whole? So, like, is there a difference between perceiving simplicity and being reductionist?
Yeah. And if I may, Blue, I'd like to bring in like some spirit from Lisa Walken from a bit prior as well, which she would be happy to add. She has strep throat right now. Lisa, feel better. But the question specifically up a bit higher was, what are the implications of tokenizing or making the illusion of concreteness, things that are more emotional, subjective, or intangible, which brings up reputation tokens. But this seems aligned, Blue, would you say, with the way that you speak about the way that reductionist approaches can lose some nuance? I'd love to hear from you before, maybe passing it to Andy or anyone else who has thoughts.
Can you maybe unpack that a little bit more, Vivek? Like, what do you see the relationship as there?
For me, the question as we explore tokens further is if they can make space for more nuance. And in the module, one of my favorite framings of it is as it is in the discussion of the commons. So maybe I can expand there. The commons is described as follows. Let me see if I can find this here. A commons is not a public space. A commons is a space which is established by custom. It cannot be regulated by law. The law would never be able to give sufficient detail to regulate a commons. And furthermore, a commons is not a resource that can be drawn down. And something about that seems to be the way that I see tokens, and like they're reduced to this thing which they have to do in some sense. They have to represent fact. But in the commons, production is not what counts, but customs, the ways that we share the tree. And I suppose that's where my mind goes, Blue, where there's this like tendency within token systems to reduce what is like a nuanced, communal, vibrant thing to like a particular action that you want to incentivize or not incentivize. I want you to share this with your friends and you get 3 tokens. So that's where I'm coming from.
That was super helpful. And I think that actually speaks to like Lisa's question about tokenizing things like that are not simple, like that might not be like emotion and things that are less concrete. I think that relates to what I actually like denoted later in the chat about information. Like you had made the comment that, complexity relates to Shannon information, and we kind of went on that tangent, but I just want to point out that like without context, like, I mean, I've spent a lot of my life and studies focusing on information theory and information dynamics, but like realized really pretty recently that like in studying information that there's more information than it can be conveyed in bits. And so like, for example, like when we think about information theory, we think frequently about like transmission of messages, like message passing. So I have a message that's bank, B-A-N-K, like I get that word, right? Like, and without knowing the words that come before or after the word bank, like I could be talking about the place where I go and put my money. I could be talking about the side of a river. I could be talking about the type of shot you make in pool, like a bank shot, right? And so, but without context, there's a ton more information there. Like, so it's pretty meaningless just to have the bit transmission of B-A-N-K without knowing the context in which you're speaking or what you're speaking about. And that to me has really been like revolutionary in the way that I'm thinking. And also like just studying it in terms of the quantum reference frame, like you can't actually ever perceive something the same way as someone else, right? If you're, if you're on a train, the person that's standing on the platform is going to look like they're moving if you're on a moving train. Similarly, the person that's on the platform will see you moving, right? Like if you're on the moving train. And then there could be like a third observer that sees what, like the person on the platform is still and the person on the train is moving. And so no one has the same perception. And so the information is all different, even though it's the same subject.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Blue and Lisa and Vivek. I think that's the first thing to say, right, is that things only become problematic when we reify or idolize them. When we recognize that the pursuit of simplicity is a process, not an endpoint. This is not a teleological phenomenon, right? Like we're not saying like we can get to simplicity. We're saying that this is a worthy design aesthetic, was the way that Celine put it. I think that that's like a much more healthy position to be in, right? Like you're not saying like it is possible to get to totally simple systems, because that does tend to belie the complexity within which we are always already swimming. The same applies to many other, like when you create art, you want to create something that's truly perfect, but also that that's impossible. And it's that tension which is the crucible that gets you to really great and moving and human art, right? It's not possible to be perfect. It's not possible to be simple. It's not possible to be complete. But it's the yearning for it and the simultaneous recognition of its impossibility which leads to that really unique human expression that is so nuanced, which is what Vivek is trying to get at. And while I agree that like lots of current implementations of these systems, particularly when we look at tokens within crypto, do obfuscate the nuance that is already implicit and present here between us right now. One of the other things that I want to touch on for a moment, because the quantum reference is a really beautiful one, and it reminds me that there is this wonderful book which I've been recommending all block long called Helgoland by an Italian quantum gravicist called Carlo Rovelli, in which he discusses the relational model of quantum mechanics, the relational model, which takes as its precedent the fact that facts are different to different observers, right? And this is where we can begin to get into an understanding of how we can have systems which are about facts that nevertheless allow for nuance, just as we can have trustless media that allow for more trusting spaces between people or the experimentation therewith. When we recognize that there's no absolute ground, reality as such, what we can perceive, is really just a web of constant interdependent interactions. Objects only have properties as they manifest to other objects. And most importantly, facts can be different to different observers. Observers here is not human. It's just another object to whose like in relationship with which your properties are made manifest. The classic example of this is Schrodinger's cat. We put a cat in a box with some sleeping gas, not cyanide, because we're not crazy. We don't like killing cats. Yeah, we like them a lot, especially in kernel. You put the cat in a box with some sleeping potion and a little radioactive decay. It either like goes off and the cat is asleep, or it doesn't go off and the cat is awake. Now, lots of people have said, no, there's branching timelines, or you need multiple different universes, or something called cubism. There's many different interpretations of the fact that the cat is in a superposition, right? Like both awake and asleep at the same time. But the relational view of quantum mechanics clears all of this up. It just says that for you, standing outside the box, observing it, the cat is in a superposition. For the cat, it's either awake or asleep. It's not in a superposition. The cat is awake or asleep. And what's really fascinating is that facts can be different for different observers, which is similar to the train analogy that you made there. And that recognition that facts are values, and they can be stored in a shared ledger by which we can reach wider agreements and engage in cooperative activities that move us towards genuine, rich, interesting, and emergent commons, is complemented by the fact and the deep understanding that like your fact need not be my fact. The contract that you opt into on Ethereum, if we go all the way back to module 1, right? The contract, what's different about law on Ethereum and systems like it is that it's opt-in, right? When I opt into a contract, I can't break the law in the way that like I can like break into your house, even though it's against the law. I can do it, right? Whereas on Ethereum, when I opt into a contract, I can't go against what the code says. I can make the code do things that are different to what people say about it. But I can't go physically, like mathematically against the code. But I do have the choice about whether I opt into it or not. This is a very different legal system than what is currently the case. And so in that same way, right, like trustless media, more trusting experiments. Facts as values on a shared ledger, and understanding that your facts need not be my facts. Law that is unbreakable, but opt-in, as opposed to law that is specified by convention and bureaucracy, but can be broken by anyone. And then we have to implement error handling or exception handling for that. These are like very big shifts in terms of our expressive potential and the way in which we can think about coordination, particularly when you recognize where the nuance really sits and where the shared protocol genuinely provides something of interest and value.
Beautiful. Let's see if there are any responses down that thread. Please feel free. Otherwise, we know we have Richu, Jacob.
I have a quick response to that thread, so I'll just jump in. The Schrodinger's cat example, I think something kind of to contrast the description Andy gave is that, you know, one of the main goals of physics, or probably the main goal of physics, is a unified theory, which is to say one set of facts, right? That the idea that the cat is both dead and alive, or that the concept of a superposition, I think, is kind of understood as like, we haven't figured it out yet, but there's something there that we may perceive as relative, but ultimately we're trying to find something that's not. That's really all I was thinking. I'm also not a physicist, so I might be wrong.
Yeah, I think so, but thank you. I think you'll find that like if you look into like Schrodinger's wave equation and the notion of like probability amplitudes, it's not like that there's something there we're unsure about. So there's like very definite probabilities that we can speak like in like very clear mathematical ways to one another about like what superpositions really mean. And like the relational view of quantum mechanics doesn't deny superposition as a phenomenon, nor does it deny entanglement or any of these strange things that occur. It just provides a fresh sort of interpretive framework which actually makes better sense of the data that we can measure in, for instance, things like Bell's inequalities, which recently were like broken. And Guillermo shared a beautiful link about that in Kernel Think Pieces if you want to go and have a real fun time looking at how reality is not real and not local. So I did like it's a different kind of thread perhaps to tokens in particular. But what I really wanted to bring out with that is that, like, what is most fascinating, right, when you begin to get lower down into like deep quantum physics or like deep mechanism design or the way languages are structured or what information is and how it's transmitted, you come up against all of these paradoxes again and again, that a unified theory somehow seems to indicate that people can have completely different perspectives, right? That a unified theory is only unified if it allows for endless and infinite plurality. How does that make sense? It must like move beyond just the linguistic comprehensive faculties of our mind. And that's where we get into like the poetic, the intensity of the awareness, the leap of faith that Kierkegaard talked about, right? Kierkegaard is like one of the most intense analytical philosophers there is, right? He's not like coming about and like writing a few poems and then being like, oh, leap of faith. He's like, no, you go through all of the steps that you possibly can to get towards these like unified logical ways of looking at the world, of your experiences and the observations that it's possible to make about them. But always inevitably, no matter what field of knowledge it is that you're looking at, you come up finally against this unsolvable paradox. Unified theory, infinite plurality. Transmission of information, unexpectedness. How do those two things, like when you think about it at a deep level, how do I transmit like that which is unexpected? It like just conceptually, it breaks your mind when you really think about it. And that's the point, right? And that's, you know, like when we're available for that kind of thing and we can approach it with humor and humility and a sense of doing it together, then there's the possibility for genuinely cooperative incentive systems, these unseen flows to come about. And to just double tap on what Vivek said, I don't think that that's the case in the majority of examples that we currently have on the table before us, especially in crypto. So I'm not trying to obfuscate a lot of what I think is pretty naive work that has happened up to this point. But I am trying to like indicate the kinds of mental models and internal attitudes that we can take toward the work that we do, which might move us collectively towards greater wisdom.
Richu, please. Thank you for your patience.
All right. Just a quick continuation on that thread. I think there's a lot of physicists who says, we are even fetishizing this sorts of unified theory where the Michio Kaku who says like we need a 2-inch equation which explains everything. A lot of people saying even if we find it, the next day is going to be pretty much the same as the previous day, then we'll be enough, that sort of thing. But so what I want to ask and the thoughts I had in mind was about the social tokens aspect. So there's this research done by this behavioral economist, Dan O'Reilly, where he did a bit of like how social interactions and then economic interactions, and when social interactions, like giving favors to each others and then paying money for those favors are two different kind of things. But if you bring these kinds of interactions onto the other market, then the whole behavior shifts. You don't really feel bad about making other people wait for you if you're paying for them. You make effort to show up on time. So the sorts of reputations, if you tokenize them, how that's gonna change behavior. So there's a little bit of research done by him on that aspect. And then what I want to ask is how social media has done this in a way, like can we consider, like, share, and subscribe as tokens for social interactions, right? And for reputation tokens, and how that's changed our way of perceiving ourselves and others, and whether that's added, meaningful stuff to our lives, positive, meaningful stuff, and also the question of, opting in. Sure, at this moment, Ethereum says, like, opting in, but right now, if you're not on any social media, socially, do you even exist? Is that even a choice right now? It's like me personally, I'm not so great at social media, but as a crypto person, if you're not in Twitter, you don't really exist, or you have to be on Twitter, do some stuff. There's that social pressure which builds up. So as Ethereum even, like, becomes more popular, then it's just the social pressure would be like, you will have to be on the platform. I mean, if and when any of those systems become, passes a threshold point of adoption, right? You're not fashionable if you're wearing 1800s fashion. You can choose to not opt in, but your whole reputation is gonna suffer. So yeah, these are the kind of things that I want to ask.
These are beautiful. If we could maybe keep the flow going, I see David's question. Would you like to, if the dogs are not barking?
Yeah, they should be good. Thank you, Vivek, and thank you, Rashid. I just think I was reading in one of my conversations with some folks in this community, and thank you for all the people if you're here. If you hit me up for a one-on-one, I was overwhelmed and so grateful for it. Somebody brought up the concept of a hyperstructure, something that is like basically unstoppable public good that like works forever. And I think in this space, we were just talking about like it's sort of beyond or sort of a side conversation of what was going on there. But Rishi, it made me think of it when you were talking about, things that can't be stopped. That like the social context for ourselves becomes so kind of overwhelming that you can't really connect to other people unless, by and large, unless you use some of these things. And so I just wonder if those things can truly be pro-social, or are they only pro-social for a time until they become sort of an end in of themselves? Like, can you actually have an unstoppable public good? And at what point might it cross over from being publicly good into something else because the connectivity around it changes? So I don't have an answer for that, but that's on my thought just now hearing this conversation.
Yeah, Rishi, thank you so much for that question, because it reminds me of an aspect of thesis points, which is worth kind of touching on before we also use hyperstructures to illustrate that, David. I think that's again, it goes back to the sense that when you like idolize or reify the means, then you end up in really, really like problematic places. So like simplicity is not an end, it's a process. Perfection is not an end that we can ever reach, it's a process. It's a particular attitude that we take to the work that we do, which amplifies excellence and inner motivation, just as simplicity does in a very particular and focused way that Salim mentioned of like a minimal design aesthetic. And that like, while I think that like every single system that I have seen so far, especially in Web3 that has to do with identity, reputation, or social aspects, whether it's tokenizing time, tokenizing work, tokenizing talent, is like, in my opinion, and it really is just my opinion, like deeply naive and probably like going to cause more problems than it solves. The reason that I think that is that it's too contrived, right? And I think that like you can use that as a great internal barometer or litmus test when you come up against these kinds of like protocols and promises, like test them out. And if they seem contrived to you, just move on, right? That's the joy of these systems, is that they give you as many fictions as possible through which you can test the truth of your own life, right? Fiction is not a trivial it's not a trivial word in my world, right? Fiction is the lie that reveals the truth. Legal fictions are incredibly powerful. The legal fiction of the firm is one of the most powerful ever told in the history of human coordination, right? And the question is, what fictions most reveal the truth of my experience in the least contrived manner? and what are the languages that those fictions are executed in, right? And that brings me to hyperstructures, David, because like it's just a fiction, right? And again, like I don't mean to trivialize it in that sense, because it's a very, very powerful one. The idea that you can deploy code that is executed according to its own logic on a public ledger that no single group, person, or institution can turn off is very, very powerful. But we can always change it, right? The 21 million limits in Bitcoin is a single line of code. I can go and make a PR now that changes that, right? Like it's not going to get merged, the code base, because there's all of this other stuff around it, the social rules and expectations of people using Bitcoin. That means that PR would have a 0.01% chance of ever getting merged, but it's not zero, right? It's not unstoppable. And the DAO on Ethereum is another example of this, right? Like code is law. Unstoppable organizations. Oh, whoops. $60 million later, actually very stoppable, right? Just under very certain social conditions. And so like, again, like very persuasive narrative when deployed genuinely for the good of the public, which is something different from public goods, I think it's very powerful. And I would love to see more of that kind of stuff. But again, like this is what I'm talking about when you begin to study cybernetics and information theory and this kind of stuff. What it always points you back towards is the humility of the designer, because by definition in cybernetic or complex systems, we cannot know the second order effects of our actions. The outputs differ greatly based on very, very small changes to the inputs. And so like, you just have to be enormously humble about your ability to say anything coherent about like what the stuff that you deploy on chain is going to do. And when we're aware of that humility, and more we're able to share the knowledge of like looking for contrivance as a litmus test with more people, then again, we can collectively, through iteration, move towards more cooperative and pro-social things that are good for the public.
Andy, you made me think I have to say what I have been thinking listening to this. And there's an alternative formulation that is the opposite of looking for contrivance. And the way it was taught to me was just the aesthetics of decision making. We talk a lot about what are the facts, and are they the same for everyone, and is this theory complete, and how complex is something or how simple is it? But these things don't ever really fully matter, because we always actually have to make choices under uncertainty. Like there's no ability to be sure that we have the right theory. There's no guarantee that we have all the relevant facts. But when we consider something, if we try to figure out what to do, and aesthetically it seems beautiful, that's a wonderful indication, not necessarily that it is the theoretically optimal choice, but that it is a good one and it is close enough. And this has enormous applicability in certain obvious areas like architecture and design. And we need to, I think, just learn to use that. Like it's a way to deal with uncertainty, is to actually trust your instincts. Is this a beautiful decision or not? It's actually surprisingly effective in all sorts of ways. And so I would encourage everyone to just keep that in mind and always think about what are the aesthetics of the decision that you're making, because that's the part of reality that you can exercise your agency over. What am I choosing to do given everything that's already in there?
That's beautiful. Thank you, Ray. A long time ago, John Keats writes this poem, Ode to a Grecian Urn. He says, beauty is truth, truth, beauty. And he uses this final couplet in that sonnet to illustrate a concept that he calls negative capability, the ability to remain in uncertainty, mystery, or doubt without irritably reaching after fact or truth. And this idea has permeated so much of English literature since that time. And a lot of my own work in the academy then had to do with a notion that I called positive capability, based primarily on the work of a writer called Toni Morrison, incredible American lady. And she wrote a number of truly moving books. The one which touched my heart the most is called Beloved. It's about the Middle Passage, the slave trade across the Atlantic, and the effect that it has on generations as is manifest in one particular family. And positive capability, I said, was the ability to not just remain in uncertainty, but see it as a ruling principle which must and can only be interacted with collectively in order to become meaningful. And so I love this notion of the beauty or the aesthetics of our choices made within uncertainty as that which leads us toward more truth, not the truth, capital T, more truth collectively, and recognizing that, like, in tandem with beauty and the aesthetics of the decision, which can still leave us in this somewhat isolated or separate place of the great individual, the genius, making his advancements alone in his white ivory tower, is instead the recognition that all of this has to be collective. Contradiction is a ruling principle of reality, and it must and can only be interacted with collectively in order to be made meaningful. You know, like the notion of relational quantum mechanics is associated in Carlo Rovelli's work with the root verses of the Middle Way, written in the 8th century BC by Nagarjuna. And there you have this same idea, right? The same idea that there's only that collective interaction with contradiction, which allows us to find the silence that is always already pregnant with meaning.
Indeed. Indeed. One of the other links from this week is Ivan Illich. Silence is a commons. There's a lot in here, but the part that stands out is here, which I can read slowly. It says, observations of the sickening effect of programmed environments show that people in them become indolent, impotent, narcissistic, and apolitical. The process breaks down because people cease to be able to govern themselves. They demand to be managed. I'm still learning a lot and being introduced to Illich through his work on decentralized schooling and the way in which we can navigate space with one another. But this seems intertwined with the conversation. Yeah. think a beautiful question from Brennan might wrap us well. Brennan, if you're willing, in your voice, as you started us off, can be a good place to.
I would be honored. I'll just read my message. This conversation has been so beautiful. If I may be so bold, I'll ask for the room. How can I incorporate all this amazing knowledge such that I become a better designer of mechanisms and token economies?
That's beautiful. Thank you, Brennan. The same question is put to Lewis Hyde at the end of a presentation that he gives about the gift. And he wrote the book, The Gift, which then filtered through to what became Burning Man culture and all sorts of stuff. He himself is a wonderful poet. And he always gets asked, how can I apply this to my life? How can I take this knowledge of the gift into the world? He says, just to be aware that there is such a thing as the spirit of the gift is already enough. It's already enough. Each of us will apply what we learn in the course of our lives in our own unique ways. And it's so critical that we are allowed to do that and encouraged to by the people that we walk with. That's what matters most. You know, Illich writes not just deschooling society, but the celebration of awareness. An amazing book, The Celebration of Awareness. And in it is an essay about the church called The Powerless Protocols. And he says that in order for the church to take the position in society where it is most beneficial and serves the people, it must give up power and once again become a celebrant of the mystery. A celebrant of the mystery. I love that. I love that. If we can build things together which celebrate the mystery of being alive, of being together, of being who we are in relationship with one another, that's it. Yeah. That's all. And it's so much.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Awesome. Beautiful. I very much appreciate everyone being with us today, all of the contributions. It's been a group effort, as I hope all can feel. And the hope is that there is some mystery that is so apparent in our closest relationships that you might take this onward into. You know, I'm going to a wedding this weekend, which I'm very excited about. And I think that there's something about those types of environments that we hope we can spend more time within, just as an alternative, as a celebration of mystery. So thank you, thank you, thank you. We'll see you soon, I'm sure. If you have any stories to share, Expo Week is intended to be a celebration, again, of these types of mysteries. So we'll see you soon. We'll see you soon.